So I made an offhanded comment in this video from the other day that Space Marines are not actually terribly interesting characters. They don't actually do terribly interesting things from a narrative and storytelling perspective. And that rubbed a few people up the wrong way, so I wanted to fully explain what I was talking about there. Because actually I do think that the range of potential stories to be told with the Space Marines is actually a lot more narrow than most people realise. They do have cool stories, and there are potentially good stories that can be told with Space Marines, but also Games Workshop as a company is kind of duty bound not to tell those stories, and this boxes them into something that is actually not terribly interesting itself. So I don't know whether you've watched Ultramarines, a Warhammer 40,000 movie, but I have. I watched it years ago, and frankly it was really boring. Basically, a squad of Space Marines have got to go and pick up a relic, and they encounter chaos, they're ambushed by chaos, and worry about purging chaos from their own ranks and whether they themselves have been infected by chaos. That's one of the few stories that can be told with Space Marines that has a proper narrative structure. And aside from the fact the animation was terrible, the story itself was not great. And the thing is, this was written by Dan Abnett, which I understand. I'm a game guy, I'm not a lore guy, I don't read the books, which is one of the reasons why everyone was like, well, yeah, in the books they're portrayed as way more strong, and they can crush a guy's head with it. Okay, fine, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? The point being, on a narrative level, there isn't that much you can do with Space Marines, right? And so, okay, making sure they don't fall to chaos is definitely one of those things, and that's broadly more representative of, again, a kind of monkish lifestyle that is dependent on following a very strict set of rules and ensuring that the taint of corruption, the heresy of outthink is not present in that order, which is all well and good, and that is in itself a fine story, even though in Ultramarines it was told in a really boring way and it was very bland, right? That is a fine story, but it's not really a story you need to tell very often, and you'd have to tell it very well for it to be particularly compelling, especially if it was to someone who wasn't otherwise invested in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Now, I'm not saying that we have to appeal to people who aren't already invested in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, but the problem I have with media that does appeal just to people who are embedded within the Warhammer 40,000 universe, it can often turn into quite rote and trite writing, as in there are a set of presuppositions that you have and an established understanding of the universe, and so it becomes, if I just hit this bell and this bell and this bell and this bell, you'll say that matched the lore and therefore that must be good. And it's like, I don't think that's sufficient to tell an actual proper story, a proper epic or a tragedy or a comedy in the sort of traditional Aristotelian way. I don't think that's sufficient. And it doesn't display a great deal of the understanding of human nature from the writer. And what does it even stir within you? Is it really you engaging with a proper aesthetic experience? Or is it you essentially being the teacher who marks the grades of Dan Abnett as he rings these bells and gets the checks the right boxes when you're watching the thing? I don't think this is sufficient. And it also speaks to, again, the limited range of things that a Space Marine can be told to do. Now, Astartes was a great example of storytelling with Space Marines done well, but Astartes was a grand total of like 10 minutes, and there was no dialogue in it. Now, that was very much to its strength, because the storytelling was all done through showing, not telling, and it showed us that what we have is an unbelievably elite set of soldiers who are incredibly well trained, incredibly well disciplined, incredibly good at their jobs, and they can conquer any challenge reasonably enough. And it was superb. Everyone loved Astartes because it was just so good. It was so good. And that's a good story. But how many times can you tell that story? So we've got two stories now, which is one explaining how good the Space Marines are. Okay, well, once that's established, and this really was the first piece of 40k media that actually really gave you the proper aesthetic experience of what it's like to face the Space Marines. And again, I concede the point. The lore does say that they are strong and they're on the table. I concede the point. You are correct. I shouldn't have mentioned it. But the nature of the story itself. Okay, well, do we need another Astartes? Or like, I mean, I would have liked a full length movie Astartes actually. But do we need another new Space Marine film that tells us, oh look, the Space Marines are incredible. They're going to kill a bunch of guys. It's like, okay, but again, it becomes kind of like the Fast and Furious films or the Transformers films. Like, in fact, the Transformers films probably have more development than that. It becomes something that is just being done for its own sake. And it's like, and that's not terribly interesting. And then you've got the other kind of story. So the third kind of story you can really tell the Space Marines is embodied in Hell's Reach, which is, again, the sort of epic last stand. And again, you see this in this Faith Warhammer animation, where it's like, it's our duty to die. It's our duty to make sure that we uphold the Emperor's will and we'll die heroically. And this is what was exemplified in, I've got to say, this is definitely my favourite scene in Space Marine 2, which is the epic battle to the death, the epic last stand, the Battle of Thermopylae, which again is a great story, but you are limited to these three stories, really. What's the relationship with the brothers and their chapter master and their adherence to orthodoxy, them poning aliens or heretics, and them dying heroically, right? That's basically what the full spectrum of the Space Marine story can be. And that then becomes kind of this full spectrum of essentially what Games Workshop wants to make, because they're fairly safe, right? They're safe things. But of course, there are people who will complain about this. This is what the problem with Warhammer 40k video was about. Saying, well, look, essentially, if you wanted to tell any of these stories, you have to presuppose that the Imperium of Man itself is good. You have to presuppose that there's a good reason for it existing. It's a good reason for them to do what they do. And that's one of the reasons why the secret level Warhammer episode was actually really good. It explored the psychology of the Space Marine, which is great. But I don't think we're going to get a lot of that, because remember, Games Workshop doesn't like the Imperium. Games Workshop adopts the chaos narrative to the Imperium itself. You'll notice, I mean, the way they describe the Imperium of Man is just the chaos narrative. All of this in slavish servitude to the living corpse of a god emperor, whose commandments are at best only half remembered, twisted by time and the fallibility of humanity. Those guys can't begin from the perspective that the Imperium is essentially necessary and good, and is what you would have to believe if you were going to write a more fleshed out Space Marine experience, right? So what they tend to do is just keep these things on very narrow and limited rails. But also, the Space Marines themselves, by their concept, are actually quite hemmed in anyway. So you've narrowed it down to, right, we've got warrior space monks who have an extremely rigid doctrine, and they are themselves extremely xenophobic, and do basically one thing really, really well. Okay, we can tell a bunch of stories about that, but the stories themselves are all going to be basically the same story, and they're not going to go very far off the beaten path. If you were to not hate your own creation, you could do loads of stuff. And actually, if you think about the scale of the Imperium of Man, there are a myriad of stories that are a lot more human, a lot more normal, or at least a lot more that are undergirded by principles that would be more applicable to a regular person's life, which is something that we would be able to properly relate to. Because it is quite a narrow constituency of people who relate to the warrior space monks upholding the sacred order of the God Emperor of mankind. I mean, I am one of those people, but I can understand that's a story that's got a limited constituency, right? Most people aren't like me and don't enjoy the world of Warhammer in the way I enjoy it. But there are so many great things you could do. Like, you could approach it from like a Planescape Torment style angle, using like one of the hive cities or something like that, and you can have a really, really intricate and complex story that became more like Game of Thrones, that was very contingent on the various relationships and events that happened in the lives of these people. But the Space Marines are outside of all of that, and so there's a wealth of human interaction and human suffering and the difficult experiences that these people go through that the Space Marines aren't really privy to. But this more political and social form of storytelling would definitely be more something that people who are not purely invested in warrior monks would be interested in. And so from a regular person's perspective, the actual stories of the Space Marines are not very interesting. But that doesn't mean the stories that come out of the Warhammer 40,000 universe can't be interesting and shouldn't be interesting. But of course, the Space Marines are the big sellers because, I mean, look at them. They're epic. So, and also, Games Workshop hating their own creation are like, okay, so we're stuck with this thing we have to do. We've got to make sure that we don't get called Nazis for doing it. And so we're going to have to hem in the potential number of stories. Because, I mean, there are some great stories that the Space Marines could tell, but they just will never have told because essentially they will have to be the justification for something the Games Workshop will be like, oh no, that's terrible, that's not liberal, we can't do that, that's mean. And it's like, okay, maybe, but, you know, sometimes xenocide is a necessary evil. In fact, sometimes it's not even an evil at all. So, just saying, you know, I kind of agree. And that's the problem. They don't want people agreeing because stories are a representation of reality. If things were this way, then it would be justified or it would be logically conclusive that it would end up in this way indeed. And they don't want to admit that. This is horrific from their own point of view. It's like, well, this is what you inherited and now you're in the woke paradigm. What are you going to do about it, Games Workshop? And the answer is make really, really dull, uninspired stories. And I mean, I am looking forward to Henry Cavill's 40K show. I hope it's going to be good, but I have a funny feeling it's just going to be a rehash of the stories that we've already seen. And I mean, I personally will say that's fine, but I think it does buttress the point that the Space Marines are not the most interesting of characters, actually. And in fact, the nature of being a Space Marine is to slice off elements of the human personality, psyche, and experience that really prevent them from being the most interesting characters. I mean, I could be wrong, and it's not that there are not interesting stories to be told from that position. It's just you would have to allow the Space Marines to be the good guys and actually interface with other people, like, you know, heretics, on a sort of philosophical or ideological level in which they were able to assert the parochial nature and the goodness of their own parochial doctrines. And I don't think Games Workshop's going to do that because they will be like, oh no, we will be encouraging the racists. We will be encouraging the fascists, the whoever's, because they will see their representation of reality as being a validation of the moral system they have already rejected. And that's going to be a real problem for them. So anyway, in conclusion, Space Marines could be interesting characters, assuming they were allowed to be, but in the current form that they are, there's actually a very narrow range of things that they can actually do, and that range is not terribly interesting, and I don't think Games Workshop's going to allow them to become interesting.